The sun was setting in the city, casting a warm orange glow on the busy streets. People rushed home after a long day, and the air buzzed with conversations and laughter. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. In a small neighborhood, pregnant Michelle was driving to the hospital. She was excited to meet her baby soon, but there was a knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was a routine drive, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. As she navigated the streets, she felt every bump in the road, her body tense as she gripped the steering wheel. Suddenly, in her rearview mirror, she spotted flashing lights. Oh no, not now, she thought, her heart racing. She had been careful, obeying the speed limit and using her turn signals. She glanced down at her watch. She couldn't afford to be pulled over now. Panic started to creep in as she pulled over to the side of the road, her hands shaking slightly. The officer approaching her car was a tall white man named Officer Blake. His expression was serious, almost predatory. "Stay calm, Michelle," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. She remembered her mother's advice, always be polite to the police. But as Blake came closer, she felt a sense of dread settle in. He didn't look like he was in a good mood. Michelle rolled down her window, and the officer leaned in, his voice gruff. "License and registration," he demanded, his eyes narrowing at her. "Of course, officer," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she fumbled through her purse. "I'm just on my way to the hospital. I'm pregnant, and I—" "Just give me your license and registration," he snapped, cutting her off. The anger in his voice startled her. She handed over the documents, her heart pounding in her chest. Blake took a moment to examine the papers, his eyes darting between her information and her face. "You were going a little too fast back there," he said, his tone condescending. "You should have pulled over faster." "I'm so sorry," Michelle said, trying to explain. "I didn't see you right away. I was just trying to get to the hospital." She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, and she tried to stay calm, but the tension in the air was thick. She sensed that he was not just angry about the speeding, it felt personal. "Do you have any idea what could happen to a child if you can't even follow simple instructions?" Blake said, his voice dripping with disdain. Michelle's heart sank. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore, it was about something deeper, something that felt like discrimination. Michelle opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Blake's demeanor shifted from annoyed to aggressive. "You think you can just do whatever you want," he sneered. "You're just another reckless driver thinking the rules don't apply to you." The words hit her like a punch. She felt her cheeks flush with humiliation and anger. "I'm not reckless. I just—" "Shut it," he barked, cutting her off again. His face was inches from hers, and she could see the anger boiling in his eyes. "You're going to listen to me." A lump formed in Michelle's throat. She had never felt this scared before. "Please, I'm just trying to get to the hospital," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm due any day now." But Officer Blake didn't care. He stepped back from the car, and Michelle noticed his hand moving to his belt. "Get out of the car," he shouted suddenly, startling her. "What? Why?" she exclaimed, confusion flooding her mind. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Get out," he shouted again, his voice booming. The panic rose within her as she realized he was serious. She didn't want to escalate things further, so she opened the door slowly, her heart racing. As she stepped out of the car, she felt vulnerable. The crowd that had gathered nearby watched in silence, some with their phones raised, recording the encounter. She could see the disbelief on their faces. "This isn't right," she thought. "Why is he treating me like this?" "Put your hands where I can see them," Blake ordered, his voice cold. "Do it now." Michelle raised her hands, confusion swirling in her mind. "Please, I'm not a threat," she said, trying to remain calm, but the fear was evident in her voice. The crowd started murmuring among themselves, sensing the tension rising. A man shouted from the back, "What's going on? Leave her alone." Blake's eyes flickered towards the crowd, anger mixing with fear. "Stay out of this," he shouted, trying to assert his authority. Michelle could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening to her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm just a pregnant woman trying to get to the hospital." Blake stepped closer, invading her personal space. "You're a danger to yourself and others. You don't get to decide how to drive. I'm the one in charge here." Michelle's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to defuse the situation. "Look, I'll cooperate," she said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I just need to get to the hospital. My baby." "Enough," he snapped, shoving her backward. The crowd gasped, and Michelle stumbled, trying to regain her balance. The weight of the moment felt unbearable as she struggled not to fall. "Stop! What are you doing?" someone from the crowd shouted, their voice filled with anger. Michelle looked at the onlookers, feeling their eyes on her. She was scared, alone, and pregnant. "Please help me," she cried out, but Blake seemed to relish the power he held over her. "Get back in your car," he shouted at the crowd, waving his baton threateningly. "Or you'll be next." The tension in the air was thick as the people exchanged worried glances. Michelle felt a rush of adrenaline. She couldn't let this continue. She had to stand up for herself. "You can't treat me like this," she yelled, her voice gaining strength. "This isn't right." Blake hesitated, caught off guard by her defiance. The crowd began to murmur, their voices rising in support of her. "You're a bully," someone shouted. Michelle felt a flicker of hope as the crowd rallied around her. Blake's confidence wavered as he glanced at the growing number of witnesses. For the first time, he seemed uncertain. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, trying to sound intimidating, but his voice lacked conviction. As Michelle looked around at the faces watching, she knew she wasn't alone. "I'm not afraid of you," she declared, her heart pounding with each word. The crowd cheered, and the energy shifted. "Let her go," someone shouted, and the chant grew louder. "Let her go! Let her go!" Blake's face twisted with rage as he realized he was losing control of the situation. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he snapped, but deep down, he knew he was outnumbered. The crowd's anger swelled, and Michelle felt empowered. "I'm just trying to get to the hospital," she reiterated, her voice steady. "You're not going to stop me." With the crowd behind her, she took a step forward, defiance radiating from her. Blake took a step back, sweat forming on his brow. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice shaking with uncertainty. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit him hard. The power he thought he had was slipping away, and for the first time, he realized that his actions had consequences. The crowd was no longer just bystanders, they were witnesses to his wrongdoing. As the scene unfolded, Michelle could feel the collective energy of the crowd surrounding her, fueling her courage. "I will not be intimidated," she cried out, her voice ringing clear. She knew that this was just the beginning of a fight for justice, a fight against the discrimination that had plagued her life and the lives of countless others. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. The stakes had never felt higher, but in that moment, she understood the importance of standing her ground. And as Blake's authority crumbled, she felt a spark of hope igniting within her, knowing that she was not alone in this battle. The sun was shining bright, but a shadow hung over the street as Officer Blake squared his shoulders and stepped closer to Michelle. The tension crackled like electricity, and the crowd sensed something big was about to happen. Michelle's heart raced as she struggled to keep calm. "What do you want from me?" she asked, trying to make her voice steady. Her mind raced with thoughts of her baby. She felt a strong urge to protect her child. "Just get out of the car," Blake shouted again, his face reddening with anger. His eyes narrowed as he glared at her. "You think you can just ignore me?" He took another step forward, and Michelle felt a rush of fear. This was not just a traffic stop, it felt like a personal attack. Nearby, the crowd was growing. People had gathered, drawn in by the shouting and the commotion. Some pulled out their phones, ready to record what was happening. "Someone call the police," a voice shouted from the back. The crowd echoed the sentiment, murmurs spreading as more and more people joined in, their expressions a mix of concern and anger. As Michelle sat in her car, tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. She was a pregnant woman facing an aggressive officer, and all she wanted was to get to the hospital for her checkup. "I'm just trying to get to my appointment," she called out, her voice trembling. The crowd gasped at her words, their attention fixed on the unfolding drama. They could see she was not a threat, she was a woman about to become a mother. But Blake was not listening. He was too focused on asserting his authority, fueled by a mindset that saw Michelle as a problem instead of a person. "You need to learn respect," he barked, clenching his fists. The anger bubbling inside him was clearly misdirected. The crowd murmured in disbelief, shaking their heads at the display of power. Many had seen similar situations before, where a badge turned ordinary people into bullies. Then, without warning, Blake lunged at Michelle's car door, yanking it open with force. "Get out," he yelled again. The crowd reacted. "What are you doing?" "She's pregnant," someone shouted, their voice rising above the rest. Michelle's heart raced, and she instinctively clutched her belly, feeling the life within her stir. "Stay back," Blake shouted, waving his baton like a wand of authority. But instead of backing off, the crowd pressed closer, their anger bubbling to the surface. They were ready to defend Michelle, to stand against the injustice unfolding right before their eyes. "Leave her alone," another voice cried out. The crowd grew louder, their collective voices rising in a chant of support. "Justice for Michelle! Justice for Michelle!" The rhythm of the chant echoed through the street, creating a wall of sound that pushed against Blake's bravado. Feeling the pressure of the crowd, Blake hesitated for a moment. He could see the determination in their eyes and realized that they were not going to let this go easily. But he quickly brushed off their voices. "I don't have time for this." "Get out of the car," he yelled again, desperation creeping into his voice. Michelle looked around, her heart pounding. The scene felt surreal. Here she was, a pregnant woman surrounded by people who cared, and yet one man was willing to strip her of her dignity. "I'm not a criminal," she shouted back, her voice strong now, fueled by the support of the crowd. "I'm just trying to get to the hospital." As the chants grew louder, Michelle noticed some of the bystanders recording the confrontation. She felt a mix of fear and empowerment. If they were recording this, maybe her voice would reach further than this street. Maybe someone would see how unfairly she was being treated. Blake could see the tide was turning, and he felt cornered. He turned his attention back to Michelle, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. "Why are you making this so hard?" he asked, his voice faltering slightly. "Just comply, and this will be over." "No," Michelle replied fiercely, shaking her head. "I'm not going to let you push me around just because you have a badge. I deserve respect." The crowd erupted in cheers, rallying behind her as they felt her strength. But Blake was losing his grip. His mind raced. This was not how he had imagined the day going. He had always seen himself as a protector, but now he felt like a fool in front of everyone. Suddenly, the sirens in the distance grew louder, and he realized that backup was on the way. He looked back at Michelle, anger rising again as he tried to reassert control. "You're just making things worse for yourself," he shouted, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. The crowd was undeterred, their chants of support growing stronger. "Let her go," someone shouted. "This is not right." The voices of the crowd filled the air, drowning out Blake's authority. He felt trapped, and the fear of being exposed for his actions started to weigh on him. Michelle stood her ground, her hands trembling slightly but her resolve unbroken. "I'm not going anywhere until you apologize," she declared, her voice clear and strong. The crowd cheered, bolstering her courage. As the sirens approached, Blake glanced nervously down the street. The sound grew closer, and he knew he had to act fast. "You think you can just talk to me like that?" he yelled at Michelle, trying to maintain his composure. But his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The tension in the air was thick, and Michelle could sense the impending arrival of more officers. She took a deep breath, ready to stand firm in the face of injustice. "I'm not afraid of you," she said defiantly, and the crowd roared in approval. Just then, the first police car pulled up, lights flashing and sirens blaring. The crowd parted slightly to make way for the new officers stepping out. Ramirez, a calm and composed officer, stepped forward. "What's going on here?" he demanded, taking in the chaotic scene. Blake's bravado began to falter. "This woman is resisting arrest," he shouted, but his voice lacked the confidence it had moments before. Ramirez's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, turning his attention to Michelle. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Ramirez asked, concern etched on his face. Michelle nodded, grateful to see a familiar face. "I just want to get to the hospital," she explained, her voice steadying. "This officer is treating me unfairly." Ramirez looked at Blake, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "Is that true?" he asked, his tone serious. Blake felt the weight of the moment, the pressure of being scrutinized by his fellow officers and the crowd. The cheers of support for Michelle echoed around him, drowning out his earlier anger. Blake shifted uneasily. "I was just following procedure," he protested, but his voice lacked the strength it had moments before. The crowd was growing louder, and Blake felt the walls closing in. As Ramirez moved closer to Michelle, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "We're here to help you." Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. Maybe this wasn't just a nightmare, maybe there was hope. Blake realized he was losing control of the situation. He glanced around at the crowd, their faces full of anger and determination. "I didn't mean to escalate things," he muttered, but it was too late. The crowd was no longer on his side. "Apologize," someone shouted from the back. "You need to make this right." The voices surged like a wave, and Blake knew he had crossed the line. The tension in the air shifted, and he felt the ground beneath him start to crumble. In that moment, the crowd erupted into chants again, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for Michelle! Justice for Michelle!" The rhythm resonated, a powerful reminder that they would not tolerate this behavior any longer. Blake's expression shifted from anger to panic as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had underestimated Michelle and the power of the community rallying around her. "Please," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Michelle felt a surge of empowerment wash over her as the crowd cheered louder, their voices lifting her spirit. She was no longer a victim, she was a warrior, standing up for herself and for everyone who had faced similar injustices. As the tension began to ease, Ramirez stepped between Blake and Michelle, ready to protect her from any further aggression. "Let's take a step back and figure this out," he said, his tone calm but firm. The crowd began to quiet down, still buzzing with energy, their anger simmering but now infused with hope. Michelle looked at Ramirez, grateful for his support. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Blake stood there, his bravado shattered. He had come to assert his authority but instead found himself exposed and vulnerable. The realization of how wrong he had been settled in, and for the first time, he felt the weight of accountability pressing down on him. In that moment, Michelle knew this was more than just a confrontation, it was a turning point. She had stood her ground, and the support of the community had made all the difference. They were not just bystanders, they were allies in the fight for justice. As the sirens continued to wail in the distance, Michelle felt hope rekindle within her. She was not alone. Together with her community, they would fight against the injustices that plagued their lives. The air buzzed with possibility, and she knew that change was within reach. The air was thick with tension as the sirens wailed closer. Michelle's heart raced, not just from fear, but from a spark of determination that ignited within her. She had to stand up, not only for herself, but for her unborn child. In those moments, with the crowd gathering around her, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, people cared enough to help. Officer Blake stood there, bathed in the flashing red and blue lights that illuminated his face. He was becoming aware that the situation was spiraling out of his control. The crowd was no longer silent. They were whispering, shouting, and pointing at him. Their eyes were full of disbelief and anger. How could he do this? They seemed to be asking, and Blake could feel their judgment burning into him. Get back, everyone! Blake shouted, trying to reassert his authority, but the confidence in his voice had vanished. This is a police matter. But the crowd wouldn't be intimidated. They had seen enough. Leave her alone, someone yelled, their voice cutting through the night. Michelle, still on the ground, took a deep breath. She could hear her baby's heartbeat thumping loudly in her ears, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. I'm just trying to get to the hospital, she yelled again, her voice rising with each word, desperate for understanding. I didn't do anything wrong. Blake's resolve began to waver as he looked around. Bystanders were pulling out their phones, recording every moment. He knew he was on camera now, and the thought of public scrutiny made him sweat. This isn't how it's supposed to go, he muttered under his breath. In the crowd, Michelle noticed a woman step forward. She was tall and fierce-looking, with an expression of unwavering strength. You can't treat her like this, the woman shouted, pointing a finger at Blake. She's pregnant. You should be ashamed of yourself. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices a symphony of support for Michelle. Feeling encouraged, Michelle pushed herself to sit up straighter. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a mother trying to take care of my baby, she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The people around her began to chant, "Justice for Michelle. Justice for Michelle." Each repetition felt like a warm blanket, wrapping her in solidarity and strength. As Blake watched the crowd rally behind Michelle, he felt cornered. I'm a police officer. I'm trained to handle situations like this, he called out, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. He had used that line countless times before, but it felt hollow now. The truth was, he was no longer the one in control. Just then, another police car arrived. Officer Ramirez stepped out, his demeanor serious as he surveyed the scene. What's going on here? He demanded, his eyes locking onto Blake. The shift in authority was palpable. Blake could feel the walls closing in around him. Blake here just assaulted a pregnant woman, the fierce woman shouted, still pointing her finger at the officer. He pushed her and threatened her for no reason. Ramirez turned his attention to Michelle, kneeling beside her. Are you okay, ma'am? He asked gently, his voice calm and reassuring. Michelle nodded slowly, still trembling but feeling a sense of relief. I just want to get to the hospital. I'm scared, she admitted, her vulnerability spilling over. Officer Ramirez's eyes softened. You're safe now. We're going to make sure you get the help you need, he promised, then glanced back at Blake, who was still trying to regain his composure. What were you thinking? Ramirez asked, his voice rising in frustration. You can't just go around pushing people like that. Blake opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He was trapped in his own web of anger and bias, and now the very system he thought he controlled was turning against him. The crowd's energy surged, emboldened by the arrival of Officer Ramirez. As the chants continued, Ramirez turned his focus back to Michelle. Let's get you up and make sure everything is okay for you and your baby, he said, offering her his hand. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. As she stood up, she felt a rush of adrenaline. Thank you, she whispered, feeling a mixture of gratitude and anger. She turned to Blake, who stood frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment. What's going to happen to him? She asked, her voice steady now. The crowd hushed, all eyes turning to Officer Ramirez, who looked conflicted. Let's just say we're going to look into this, Ramirez said cautiously, glancing at Blake. The weight of his words hung in the air, the implications of accountability for Blake's actions starting to settle in. Michelle felt a surge of hope as she looked at the crowd, which had grown even larger. People were stepping forward, offering their support, their faces lit with determination. We're not going to let this go unnoticed, someone shouted, and the crowd erupted in cheers. As the energy built around them, Blake's bravado faded into the background. He was no longer the center of attention, and the truth of his actions was becoming painfully clear. The more he tried to defend himself, the weaker he appeared. Michelle took a deep breath, trying to collect her thoughts. "I just want to be treated like anyone else," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "I deserve respect. My baby deserves respect." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing off the buildings. The situation had transformed from a tense confrontation into a powerful statement against discrimination. Blake felt the walls closing in, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. As Ramirez continued to speak with Michelle, a man in the crowd stepped forward. "I'm a lawyer," he announced, his voice carrying. "I'd like to help you with this. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." A wave of support swept through Michelle, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. This was the community she had hoped for, the kind of support that could stand against injustice. "Thank you," Michelle said, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Blake's face paled as he realized the consequences of his actions were just beginning. The crowd was mobilizing, and Michelle was no longer a victim, she was a force for change. The chants grew louder, filling the air with determination. Justice for Michelle. Justice for all. The crowd became a united front, ready to take on the system that had allowed such acts of discrimination to occur. As the night wore on, the reality of the situation sank in for Blake. He was not just facing angry citizens, he was confronted with the undeniable truth that his actions had consequences. And in that moment, he was not just a cop, he was a man who had to face the truth of his own biases. Michelle felt empowered as she looked at the crowd surrounding her. "We are stronger together," she shouted, her voice echoing through the night. "We will not be silenced." In that moment, the rallying cry became more than just a plea for justice, it became a promise that they would stand together against discrimination, no matter the cost. As the lights flashed and the chants continued, Michelle felt a sense of hope blossom within her, knowing that this was just the beginning of their fight for equality. The noise of approaching sirens echoed down the street, growing louder with each passing second. Michelle felt her heart race as she realized help was on the way. She looked over at Blake, the officer who had just attacked her. His expression shifted from anger to panic, a flicker of fear crossing his face as he noticed the crowd gathering. In the midst of chaos, Michelle clung to the hope that justice would prevail. As Officer Ramirez stepped out of his patrol car, he immediately sensed the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he shouted, scanning the scene. His voice was firm, but Michelle could hear the hint of concern in it. She felt a small wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was here who might understand. Blake straightened up, desperately trying to regain his authority. "This woman is resisting arrest," he barked, but the bravado in his voice faltered under the weight of Officer Ramirez's presence. Michelle shook her head vigorously, her voice steady despite her fear. "No. I'm not resisting. I'm just trying to get to the hospital." The crowd, witnessing the exchange, began to murmur among themselves. They had seen how Blake had treated Michelle, and they were not happy. "He hit her. He needs to be held accountable," one man shouted. The voices of support surged, creating a powerful wave of solidarity. Officer Ramirez turned his attention to Blake, eyebrows raised. "You know this isn't how we handle things, Blake. You're escalating the situation." His tone was stern, and Michelle could see that he was not going to let Blake off easily. The other officer had a reputation for standing up against unnecessary force, and Michelle felt hopeful that he might be her ally. "Look, I was just doing my job." Blake protested, but his argument sounded weak and desperate. Michelle could see the shift in the air as more people began to rally around her, the tension thickening. She felt empowered, standing her ground against the man who had tried to harm her. "Your job?" Ramirez echoed, crossing his arms. "Is your job to hurt innocent people? She's pregnant. What were you thinking?" Michelle felt a rush of gratitude toward Officer Ramirez. He was calling out Blake's actions, exposing the truth of the situation for everyone to see. With the crowd murmuring in agreement, Michelle took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice rising with strength. "I just wanted to get to my doctor. Why was I treated like a criminal?" Her question hung in the air, a challenge that resonated with the onlookers. Blake's face flushed with anger, but he knew he couldn't lash out at Ramirez without facing serious consequences. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, his bravado evaporating. "I thought she was a threat," he muttered defensively. "A threat?" Ramirez shot back, disbelief evident in his tone. "How could she be a threat? You should have approached her with care, not aggression." The crowd began to cheer for Ramirez, their voices rising in unison, creating a powerful echo of support for Michelle. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Blake realized he was losing control of the situation. The fear he had once instilled in Michelle was now directed at him, and it terrified him. "You don't understand. I had to make a quick decision," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Michelle's heart raced as she felt the crowd rally around her. "You could have asked me what was happening. You could have treated me with respect," she shouted, the fire in her voice growing stronger. The words flowed from her, fueled by a sense of injustice that had been building inside her. "I'm sorry, I was wrong," Blake finally blurted out, his voice shaking as the realization of his actions hit him. The crowd gasped, surprised at his sudden admission. Michelle stood tall, feeling empowered by the support of those around her. "Sorry isn't enough," a woman from the crowd shouted. "You need to face the consequences for what you did." The crowd echoed her sentiment, chanting for justice and accountability. Michelle felt the energy of their support surging through her, giving her the strength to confront Blake directly. "Why should we believe you?" Michelle asked, looking straight into Blake's eyes. "You didn't care about me or my baby. You only saw a black woman, and that's why you acted the way you did." The truth of her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the discrimination she had faced. Blake's expression shifted, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I didn't mean to," he started, but Michelle cut him off. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" "That's not good enough," she shouted, her voice rising in intensity. "You need to understand how your actions affect people like me every day." The crowd erupted in support, their voices uniting in a chorus of agreement. "Accountability. Justice. Respect," they chanted, the rhythm pulsing through the air. Michelle felt a surge of hope as the crowd gathered around her, their determination fueling her own. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. With Blake standing there, cornered by the truth of his actions, Michelle took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us," she declared, her voice steady. "We need to stand together against this kind of behavior." The crowd cheered, their support electrifying the air around her. As Officer Ramirez stepped closer, he nodded in agreement. "We will not tolerate this kind of treatment in our community," he said, his tone firm. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their skin color." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing through the streets. Blake, feeling the pressure of the moment, began to back away. He was losing control, and he knew it. I'll make this right," he stammered, desperation evident in his voice. But Michelle wasn't satisfied. "I want more than just words," she said firmly. "I want to know that this won't happen again. You need to face the consequences of your actions." The crowd murmured in agreement, their collective voice rising in strength. They had seen enough, and they were ready to demand change. In that moment, Michelle understood the power of her voice. She had the ability to stand up against injustice and inspire others to do the same. "Together, we can create a better world," she said, addressing the crowd. "We can make sure that everyone is treated fairly, no matter what." The crowd roared with approval, their energy palpable as they rallied around her. As Blake stood there, realizing he was surrounded by a united front demanding justice, he felt a wave of humility wash over him. For too long, he had been blinded by his biases, and now he was confronted with the reality of his actions. "I'll do better," he finally admitted, his voice trembling. "I promise." But the crowd remained skeptical. "Promises don't mean anything unless there are actions to back them up," someone shouted. The crowd echoed the sentiment, their chants ringing out in agreement. Michelle took a step forward, looking Blake in the eye. "You need to make this right. You need to take responsibility for what you did." She could see the fight leaving him, and for a moment, she felt a sense of victory. The fight wasn't just for her, it was for everyone who had faced similar treatment. The crowd began to disperse slightly, but their energy remained high, buzzing with the possibility of change. "We're not going to let this go," a young man declared, raising his fist in solidarity. "We will hold you accountable." As the crowd began to chant once more, Michelle felt a rush of hope. Blake stood there, humbled and surrounded by the very people he had tried to intimidate. In that moment, he realized that the real power lay not in his badge, but in the strength of the community standing together. The sirens in the distance faded, but the echoes of their voices remained, a promise that they would not be silenced. Michelle looked around at the crowd, feeling gratitude swell within her. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said, her voice filled with emotion. The crowd erupted in cheers, their solidarity fueling her determination. They were ready to fight for justice, not just for Michelle, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination and injustice. And as they stood together, they knew that their voices would not be silenced again. The tension in the air felt like a heavy blanket, suffocating and thick. Michelle could feel her heart racing, thumping against her chest like a drum. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself as Officer Ramirez approached her with concern. The sound of the crowd chanting her name echoed in her ears, mixing with the distant wail of sirens approaching. She felt a mix of fear and hope, maybe someone was finally there to help her. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Officer Ramirez asked gently, his voice filled with genuine concern. He glanced at the other officers, sensing the shift in the crowd's mood. Michelle nodded, but her voice trembled as she replied, "I just want to get to the hospital. I'm pregnant." The crowd erupted with renewed energy, their chants growing louder. "Justice for Michelle! Justice for Michelle!" The solidarity around her fueled her determination. She was no longer just a frightened pregnant woman, she was part of something bigger, a movement against injustice. Blake, feeling the pressure, clenched his fists and glared at the crowd. "This is not how you handle things," he shouted, trying to regain some control. But the authority in his voice was fading, replaced by desperation. Michelle could see the cracks forming in his bravado, and it gave her hope. "Why are you treating me like this?" Michelle challenged, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything wrong. I'm just trying to get to my appointment." Her words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of her humanity in the face of aggression. The crowd's chants shifted, becoming more rhythmic, more unified, like a heartbeat of resistance. "We see you. We hear you." Officer Ramirez stepped closer to Michelle, trying to bridge the gap between her and the aggressive officer. "You're safe now," he assured her, his tone warm and respectful. He turned to Blake, whose earlier aggression was now replaced by a hint of uncertainty. "What's going on here?" he asked, his gaze steady and unwavering. Blake hesitated, his bravado cracking under the weight of Ramirez's scrutiny. "She was resisting arrest," he stammered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. The crowd erupted in disbelief, their voices rising like a wave crashing against the shore. "She's just trying to live her life," someone shouted from the back. Michelle's heart raced as she looked from Ramirez to Blake. This was her moment to be heard, to stand up against the officer who had treated her so poorly. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a pregnant woman who deserves respect," she shouted, her voice carrying strength. The crowd responded with applause, rallying behind her, ready to support her fight for justice. Blake, feeling the heat of the crowd's anger, stepped back, his confidence wavering. "You don't understand," he muttered, glancing around as if searching for an escape. "I was just doing my job." But the more he tried to justify his actions, the more the crowd pressed in. They weren't going to let him dismiss this moment. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to attack innocent people." Michelle shot back, her voice steady. You don't get to decide who is worthy of respect based on your prejudices. The words hung in the air, and the crowd erupted in cheers. They could feel the power of Michelle's voice resonating, her bravery shining like a beacon in the dark. As the crowd's support grew, Michelle could see Blake's bravado slipping away. He glanced at Ramirez, who was shaking his head, clearly disappointed in Blake's actions. This isn't how we handle things, Ramirez said, his tone firm. You need to recognize the impact of your actions. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Blake stammered, looking around at the sea of faces that were now directed at him, waiting for his next move. I was just trying to keep the peace. His voice wavered, revealing the cracks in his once strong demeanor. Peace, a voice from the crowd called out. You think attacking a pregnant woman is keeping the peace? The crowd erupted into murmurs, the anger palpable in the air. They were ready to stand up for Michelle, to make sure her voice was heard. Michelle took a deep breath, feeling the support wash over her. I just want to go to the hospital. I'm scared for my baby. Her voice trembled, revealing the vulnerability beneath her strength. The crowd softened, their chants shifting from anger to support. Let her go. Let her go. As the chants continued, Blake began to feel cornered. He had never experienced this kind of public backlash before. The weight of their judgment pressed down on him, and he could sense the tide was turning against him. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Michelle's courage was shining through, and it was hard to ignore. I didn't mean to escalate things, Blake said weakly, his voice faltering. He could see the disappointment in Ramirez's eyes, the way the crowd was rallying around Michelle. He had misjudged the situation completely. I just thought she was a threat, he mumbled, but the crowd erupted in outrage. Just because she's black, a voice shouted. Just because she's pregnant? The crowd was relentless, their voices echoing off the walls around them. Michelle felt a surge of empowerment as she stood her ground. You don't get to decide who is a threat based on your prejudices, she yelled, her voice unwavering. I deserve respect, just like anyone else. The crowd erupted in cheers, their support electrifying the air. They were standing together, united in their fight against discrimination. Blake's heart raced as he realized he had lost control of the situation. I'm sorry, he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. I didn't mean it. But the crowd wouldn't let him off the hook that easily. They were tired of the excuses, tired of the discrimination that had plagued their community for too long. Your apology doesn't change what you did. Michelle shouted back, her voice steady. You need to be held accountable for your actions. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices merging into a powerful statement against the injustices they had witnessed. In that moment, Blake knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. The support for Michelle was overwhelming, and he could feel the tide turning against him. I'll take responsibility, he stammered, the words barely escaping his lips. I see that now. But the crowd's outrage lingered, and they wouldn't let him forget. As Michelle looked around at the crowd rallying behind her, she felt a sense of hope blossom within her. This wasn't just her fight, it was their fight. Together, they could challenge the system that had allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked for far too long. I'm not just standing up for myself, Michelle said, addressing the crowd. I'm standing up for everyone who has faced discrimination, everyone who has been treated unfairly because of their skin color. The crowd erupted in applause, their unity reinforcing her resolve. Blake watched as Michelle's words resonated with the crowd, realizing the weight of the moment. He had underestimated the strength of the community, the power of their voices united against injustice. This was a turning point, and he could no longer hide behind his badge. As the crowd continued to chant, Blake felt the pressure of the moment intensify. He had crossed a line, and now he was faced with the reality of his actions. I'm sorry, he said, his voice filled with remorse. I truly am. Michelle took a step forward, her heart racing as she faced him. Your apology is a start, but it's not enough. You need to understand the impact of your actions. You need to change. The crowd roared in approval, their support unwavering. As Blake stood there, feeling the weight of his mistakes, he realized he had a choice to make. He could either continue to fight against the tide of change, or he could embrace it, acknowledge his wrongdoings, and work towards being better. The decision was his, but the path forward was clear. Together, we can create a better future, Michelle said, her voice steady. One where everyone is treated with respect, regardless of their skin color. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers ringing out as they united in a shared vision for change. In that moment, Blake felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps he could change. Perhaps he could learn from this experience and strive to be a better officer, one who truly protected and served his community. The journey ahead would not be easy, but he knew it was necessary. As the crowd began to disperse, Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had stood up for herself, for her baby, and for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. The fight was far from over, but they had taken a significant step forward. With a newfound sense of empowerment, Michelle took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. Together with her community, she would continue to challenge the injustices that plagued their world. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they wouldn't back down. As the chaos from the previous moments began to settle, the air hung thick with tension and uncertainty. Michelle stood her ground, her heart pounding loudly in her chest, and her breath coming in quick bursts. Around her, the crowd continued to murmur in disbelief, and she could feel their collective gaze weighing heavily on Officer Blake. This was a pivotal moment, one where the balance of power was shifting right before her eyes. "Let's get back to the car," Officer Ramirez suggested, glancing at Michelle. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaotic atmosphere. He took a step forward, ready to escort her away from the scene if necessary. But Michelle shook her head, determined not to back down. "No. I need to stand here. He attacked me, and I won't let him pretend it didn't happen," Michelle declared, her voice ringing out clearly. The crowd, hearing her words, began to stir with renewed energy, their support filling her with confidence. Blake was visibly sweating, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. "I was just following protocol," he stammered, desperation creeping into his tone. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Many in the crowd had heard this excuse before, and it only fueled their anger. "Protocol doesn't mean hurting someone," a voice shouted from the back, echoing the frustration felt by many. "You can't just attack people because of your biases." Michelle turned to face the crowd, her eyes wide with gratitude for their support. She had never felt so empowered, yet so scared at the same time. "Listen, I didn't mean to hurt you," Blake insisted, taking a step forward, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. "I was just trying to do my job." "Doing your job shouldn't involve violence," Michelle shot back, her voice rising. "I was scared for my life. I was just trying to get to the hospital for my baby." The emotion in her voice cut through the tension, and the crowd gasped, feeling the weight of her words. Just then, a woman stepped forward from the crowd, her expression fierce. "You think you can bully people just because you wear a badge? We're tired of this. This isn't about doing your job, this is about accountability." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices merging into a powerful chorus. In that moment, Michelle realized they were not just fighting for her, they were standing up against a system that had long overlooked the rights and safety of Black individuals. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of purpose wash over her. This was bigger than her. This was about everyone who had faced injustice and discrimination. "I want to press charges," Michelle shouted, surprising herself. She felt a surge of strength as the words left her lips. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. "We can't let this go unnoticed." Blake's face paled, and he stepped back, realizing the implications of her statement. "You don't need to do that," he pleaded, his voice shaky. "Let's just calm down and talk about this." But the crowd was no longer interested in talking, they wanted justice. "Justice? You think you deserve to be treated like a human being after what you just did?" Michelle's voice was fierce. I'm the one who deserves justice here. The tension was electric, and the crowd's emotions were running high. Let's not escalate this further, Officer Ramirez interjected, attempting to defuse the situation. But his words fell flat as the crowd continued to chant Michelle's name, demanding accountability for Blake's actions. Enough. This is a police matter. Blake shouted, but his tone lacked authority. It was clear he was losing control, and the crowd sensed it. They were emboldened by Michelle's bravery, ready to support her fight for justice. You think we're going to stand by while you bully a pregnant woman? A young man shouted, stepping forward to join Michelle. We're not afraid of you. This is our community, and we're not going to let you destroy it. The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices ringing out with determination. Blake's facade began to crumble as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He had never faced such public scrutiny, and it was unsettling. I was just doing my job, he repeated, but the crowd's anger only intensified. We can see right through you, someone else yelled. You're scared because you know you did something wrong. The energy in the air shifted. It was no longer just about Michelle. It was about standing against the systemic injustices that plagued their community. Look around, Michelle urged, pointing at the faces in the crowd. This isn't just about me. This is about all of us who have been mistreated and discriminated against. The crowd erupted in cheers, their solidarity a powerful force that filled the air. Blake took a deep breath, realizing he had underestimated the strength of the community. He glanced at Officer Ramirez, who shook his head, clearly disappointed in his partner's actions. You need to take responsibility for what you've done, Ramirez said, his tone firm. This isn't going to go away. I didn't mean for it to escalate. Blake stuttered, his confidence waning as he faced the reality of his actions. The realization that he was the one in trouble began to sink in, and for the first time, he felt vulnerable. The crowd began to chant, their voices rising in unison. Accountability. Justice. Respect. Each word echoed through the streets, reverberating in Michelle's heart. She felt a surge of hope, knowing they were all fighting together for what was right. In that moment, Blake dropped his baton, realizing he could no longer maintain his authority. I messed up, he admitted, his voice shaky. I was wrong. I'm sorry. The crowd fell silent, surprised by his admission. It was a moment of vulnerability that shifted the dynamics of power. Michelle looked at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. You think saying sorry makes it all okay? She asked, her voice steady. You don't get to hurt people and then just apologize. You need to face the consequences of your actions. The crowd murmured in agreement, and the atmosphere shifted once again. This was not just about apologies, it was about justice and accountability. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again, someone shouted from the crowd, igniting a wave of cheers. Michelle's heart raced as she realized the power of unity. Together, we can change things, she declared, her voice ringing with determination. The crowd erupted into applause, their support a powerful reminder that they were not alone in their fight. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard, and Blake's eyes widened in panic. No! You can't call for backup, he shouted, fear evident in his voice. But it was too late. The crowd was resolute, standing firm in their demand for justice. As the police cars pulled up, officers stepped out, assessing the scene. What's going on here? One officer asked, looking between Blake and the crowd. Ramirez stepped forward, ready to explain. This officer has used excessive force against a pregnant woman, and we need to take action. Michelle felt a sense of relief wash over her as the backup officers began to understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't just about one officer's mistake, it's about a pattern of discrimination and violence, she shouted, her voice strong. The arriving officers nodded, understanding the need for accountability. We're going to take this seriously, one officer said, glancing at Blake. You need to cooperate. Blake stood there, realizing the walls were closing in. I didn't mean for this to happen, he pleaded, but the crowd was no longer listening. They had witnessed too much, and their resolve was unbreakable. As the situation unfolded, Michelle took a deep breath, feeling empowered by the support of those around her. They were standing up for justice, refusing to be silenced any longer. She had found her voice, and together with the community, they would continue to fight against discrimination and violence. "I will not back down," Michelle declared, raising her head high. "This is just the beginning of our fight for justice. We will not let this happen to anyone else." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices uniting in a powerful statement against injustice. As Blake was taken aside by the backup officers, Michelle felt a sense of triumph. They were reclaiming their power, and the fight was far from over. This was a moment of change, a turning point that would resonate within the community for years to come. Together, they would continue to demand justice, and Michelle knew that they would not be silenced. The tension in the air was electric as the crowd surrounded Officer Blake and Michelle. It felt like the world had stopped for a moment, all eyes on Blake, the officer who had used his badge to hurt an innocent pregnant woman. Michelle stood tall, her heart pounding, but she was filled with strength. "I deserve respect," she declared, her voice ringing out clear and strong. The people around her cheered, their voices blending into a chorus of support. Blake, who had been so full of bravado just moments ago, now found himself shrinking under the weight of the community's gaze. He was used to being the one in control, the one with authority. But here, surrounded by angry and determined faces, he felt small. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Then why did you?" Michelle shot back, her tone firm. "Why did you think it was okay to hit me just because you could?" The crowd grew louder, chanting her name, encouraging her to stand her ground. Blake's bravado was melting away, replaced by fear and regret. As the chants echoed through the streets, Blake felt his heart race. He had never expected a simple traffic stop would lead to this moment, where he was being called out for his actions. He had always thought he was doing his job, keeping the streets safe. But now, he realized he had let his biases cloud his judgment, and it had cost him dearly. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, sensing Blake's panic. "This isn't how we treat people, Blake," he said, his voice low and steady. "You know better." The crowd listened, their energy shifting as they focused on Ramirez. They knew him as a fair officer, someone who understood the community's struggles. Blake looked at Ramirez, searching for support but finding only disappointment. "I was just doing what I thought was right," he stammered, but even he could hear the weakness in his words. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen too much. They had experienced too much. "You don't get to hurt someone because you think they're suspicious," Ramirez replied, shaking his head. "You're supposed to protect us, not attack us." His words resonated with the crowd, echoing the sentiment they had all felt. Michelle took a step closer, her voice softening but still firm. "I was just trying to get to the hospital, officer. I was scared, and instead of helping me, you hurt me." Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back, refusing to show weakness. She needed to be strong for her baby and for everyone watching. Blake felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had seen the fear in her eyes and had chosen to ignore it. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought," but he didn't finish his sentence. He realized he didn't have an excuse for his behavior. "Thought what?" a voice from the crowd shouted. "Thought you could just bully her because she was black?" The crowd erupted into murmurs, nodding in agreement. Michelle stood her ground, her expression a mix of defiance and vulnerability. Blake felt trapped. He had never thought of himself as a racist, but his actions spoke louder than his intentions. "I thought I was keeping the peace," he muttered, looking at the ground, ashamed. "But I can see now that I was wrong." The crowd fell silent, absorbing his words. They had never heard a cop admit he was wrong, especially one who had hurt someone. "This isn't just about one person," Michelle said, her voice steadying. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to happen over and over again." The onlookers began to nod, and Blake could feel the weight of their gaze. You need to understand how your actions affect us, Michelle continued. This isn't just about me being pregnant, it's about every single person who has been targeted simply for existing. Blake felt the gravity of her words. He had always seen himself as a protector, but now he realized he was part of a bigger problem. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I really am. Sorry doesn't cut it, a woman from the crowd shouted. You need to be held accountable for what you've done. The crowd erupted in agreement, and Blake knew they were right. He had crossed the line, and the only way to make things right was to face the consequences. In that moment, he looked around and saw the fear and anger in the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. They were tired of being mistreated and disrespected. He could feel their pain, their frustration. What do I need to do? He asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The crowd began to shout suggestions, their voices rising in a unified call for justice. You need to apologize to her, someone yelled. You need to face disciplinary action, another voice chimed in. Michelle nodded, her heart racing. Yes, you need to understand that your actions have consequences. You can't just hurt people and walk away. Blake's eyes widened as he took in their demands. He had never faced a situation like this before, and for the first time, he felt vulnerable. I'll do it, he said, his voice filled with determination. I'll face whatever comes next. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a powerful reminder that change was possible. Michelle felt a surge of hope, knowing they were all in this together. Thank you, she said softly, her voice full of emotion. Thank you for standing with me. As the crowd rallied around her, Blake took a deep breath. He knew this was just the beginning of a long journey. He had to confront his own biases and learn to be better. The path wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to take that first step. The air was charged with energy, and Blake felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had a long road ahead, but he was determined to make a difference. He would listen, learn, and grow. He had to do better, for Michelle, for the community, and for himself. As the crowd began to disperse, Blake stood there, surrounded by people who had once viewed him with fear. But now, they were willing to give him a chance to change. And in that moment, he knew he had to take it. The tension in the air was palpable as Michelle stood her ground. She felt a mixture of fear and empowerment, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd that had gathered around her was a wave of support, their faces a mix of anger and determination. Officer Blake, realizing the consequences of his actions, was now facing the truth about what he had done. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, and now he was trapped in a situation he couldn't control. As Michelle's voice rang out, the crowd leaned in, eager to hear her next words. This isn't just about what happened today, she began, her voice strong and clear. This is about how we, as a community, are treated every day. I deserve respect, just like everyone else. Her words struck a chord, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. They were united, standing together against the injustice they had all witnessed. Blake's face flushed with embarrassment as he felt the weight of the crowd's scrutiny. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said, his voice shaky. I made a mistake. He took a step back, his bravado crumbling as he realized that he was no longer the authority figure he thought he was. The crowd's anger had shifted the power dynamics, and he was now the one on trial. Michelle stepped forward, a fire ignited within her. You didn't just make a mistake, Officer Blake. You let your biases take control. You acted without thinking, and that's not okay. The crowd echoed her sentiments, their voices rising in agreement. The energy was electric, and Michelle felt a surge of hope. This was a moment of change, they were standing up for their rights, and she was at the forefront. Please, I didn't mean for it to escalate like this, Blake pleaded, his voice a whisper now. I just wanted to do my job. The crowd's reaction was swift and loud. Your job is to protect us, not to harm us, someone shouted, the words ringing true. The chants of the crowd intensified, and Blake looked around, his fear evident. The support for Michelle was overwhelming, and he was beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. Michelle took a deep breath, grounding herself. You need to understand that what you did affects all of us. It's not just about one incident, it's about a pattern of behavior that we can no longer accept. We're tired of being treated unfairly. The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a powerful reminder that they were not going to back down. They were demanding change, and it was happening right before their eyes. Blake's face contorted with shame as he absorbed the weight of Michelle's words. I see that now, he stammered, his bravado completely stripped away. I never thought of it that way. Michelle's heart raced as she saw a flicker of realization in his eyes. This could be the turning point they had all been waiting for, a chance for change, for understanding. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again, she urged, her voice steady and strong. We need accountability in our community, and that starts with you, Officer Blake. The crowd shifted, murmuring in agreement. They wanted action. They wanted to ensure that no one else had to endure what Michelle had just faced. The atmosphere crackled with energy, and it was clear that this moment would be etched in their memories forever. Blake's shoulders sagged as he faced the crowd. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I'll do better. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. The crowd went silent, taken aback by his admission. For the first time, Blake was acknowledging his wrongdoing. This was a crucial step forward, and Michelle could feel the shift in the air. Actions speak louder than words, she reminded him, her tone firm yet encouraging. You have to show us that you mean it. The crowd nodded in agreement, eager to see if Blake would follow through on his promise. This was a pivotal moment, a chance for healing and understanding to flourish. Blake looked around at the sea of faces that had come together in solidarity. I promise to listen to you all, he said, his voice stronger now. I will learn from this experience and work to earn your trust. The crowd erupted in applause, a mixture of hope and skepticism. They knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Michelle felt a wave of relief wash over her as she realized that they had made a difference. They had stood together, united against discrimination and injustice. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for supporting me. This isn't just my victory, it's ours. The crowd cheered, their unity a powerful force against the darkness that had threatened to overshadow them. As the crowd began to disperse, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. This moment would not be forgotten. It was a catalyst for change, a reminder that their voices mattered. Blake had a long way to go, but he had taken the first step toward understanding the impact of his actions. With the sun setting behind them, Michelle looked around at her community, grateful for their support. They had shown her that they would stand together, no matter the challenges they faced. This was just the beginning of a journey toward justice and equality, and she was ready to take it on, one step at a time. As she walked away from the scene, surrounded by her friends and family, Michelle felt a sense of hope blooming in her heart. They had fought for what was right, and together, they would continue to push for a better future, one where everyone was treated with respect, no matter their background. The battle wasn't over, but with each voice that joined the chorus for justice, they were making strides toward a brighter tomorrow. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.